So, the Jewish month of Cheshvan, which we are in, is most famous for the things that it doesn't have. And of course, it's famous for not having holidays, for being a whole month without holidays. And that makes even more exciting a story that we learn from Sefer Melachim, from the Book of Kings, um, a story about a holiday in the month of Cheshvan. So, okay, here's how we get to that. So, of course, the book opens with David Hamelech in his old age on the throne, and it discusses the end of his reign and the ascendance of his son Shlomo. And those are like the glory days of the United Monarchy, that one really short period when all the tribes of Israel were actually part of one kingdom. But before long, we know that infighting breaks out. The kingdom splits apart between the southern kingdom of Yehudah, ruled over by the house of David, and then the northern kingdom of Israel, that's ruled by a succession of different dynasties. Um, and the first king, the very first king of the northern kingdom of Israel, was a man named Yeravam ben Nebat, right? We all know about him, Yeravam ben Nebat. In the past, when I've learned this book with my kids, we always call Yeravam the evil genius because he was a clever guy. He realized that if you wanted the northern tribes to fully secede from the United Monarchy, that it wasn't enough to just declare independence. If that's all you did, then there was always a danger that the people of the north might reconsider and they might be tempted to reunite again later with the southern kingdom. And so to protect against that, we're told the Ravam came up with kind of a devious plan. He thought that if you really want to separate tribe from tribe, if you want to permanently separate Bnei Israel into two kingdoms, then you need more than physical independence. What you need is spiritual independence. And so we're told in the 12th chapter of the first book of Kings that Yerovam created two new temples that the people in his kingdom could go to instead of schlepping all the way down south to the Beit HaMikdash in Yerushalayim. He placed one way up in the north in the town of Dan, and he put another one further south in Beit El. And shockingly, he put golden calves in them. Shnei Eglei Zahav. He actually put golden calves in these two temples. And he appointed new Kohanim, new priests that would be ministers who were not from the tribe of Levi. And presumably these would be priests who would be loyal to him. And then, after all that, here comes the real genius move. So we're told that here's how there's a line again in the 12th chapter of the first book of Kings, Vayas Yeravam Chag. And Yeravam made a holiday, Chag, Bechodesh Hashmini, Bechamisha Asar Yom Lechodesh, in the 8th month and the 15th day of that month, Kachag Asher Yehuda, just like the holiday that was in Yehuda. Now we know that Chag in the Torah means Sukkot. So what that's telling us is that Yeravam basically said, instead of celebrating Sukkot in Tishrei in the 7th month, in his normal time like we do, from now on in his kingdom, they would celebrate Sukkot 1 month later, on the 15th of Cheshvan. So they had a holiday in the month of Cheshvan, in fact, Sukkot. And instead of going all the way down to the Beit HaMikdash, he said, we'll celebrate it at our own local temples, right here in our own kingdom. So that's the evil genius. He realized that if you want to divide up Bnei Israel, don't just divide them up physically, divide them up spiritually. And he was successful because the kingdoms never did reunite. We keep reading. The whole book of Malachim tells about kind of how it goes with these two kingdoms that often are fighting against each other like enemies. And just to remind ourselves about how bad it got between these two kingdoms. It wasn't just like two, kingdoms of Bnei Israel sitting next to each other. So often they were literally fighting against each other. Let's just remind ourselves about a couple of the lowlights of the relationship between those two kingdoms. So one comes up a couple chapters later, in the second book of Kings, right, in Melachim Bet. We have to wait until that to learn the story of how King Amaziah of Yehudah actually challenged King Yehoash of Yisrael to battle. Okay, and that's what happened. The two kingdoms went to war against each other. And in that case, The kingdom of Yehuda, the one that started the war, lost very badly. And after they lost to the kingdom of Israel, here's what happened next. It tells us that the king of Israel, quote, marched on Jerusalem, and he made a breach of 400 cubits in the wall of Jerusalem, from the Ephraim gate to the corner gate, and he carried off all the gold and silver and all the vessels that were in the house of Hashem and in the treasuries of the royal palace, as well as hostages, and he returned to Shomron. So this is a crazy story. The army of the northern kingdom of Israel not only wins a battle against the kingdom of Yehuda, who kind of picks a fight with them, but they're not just satisfied to win the battle. They then attack Yerushalayim, break through the walls, carry off the treasures of the Beit HaMikdash and the wealth of all the treasuries and captives and take them up north. I mean, when you hear that, they sound like the Babylonians. But this was the kingdom of Israel that did that at the end of this war. Okay, that's one low point. Here's another. And these are just examples, but they're particularly bad ones. So another story, this time about, it's a little later, about the kingdom of Israel in the north. They partnered with the king of Aram. So that's, a different kingdom, but also up in the north. They partner together and they attack Yehuda together. Again, you have the two kind of Jewish kingdoms, two kingdoms of Israel, Bnei Israel, at war. This time it's Israel / Aram, that confederation, laying siege against Yerushalayim. And while he's sitting under siege, King Achaz of Yehuda, this is his plan to save himself. He reaches out to an even greater power, which is Ashur, Assyria. So basically, Achaz of Yehuda reaches out to Assyria and he says, come save me. And that's what happened. Assyria came down, they marched south, and they completely destroy the kingdom of Israel. And when I say completely destroy, we know they didn't just beat them in battle, they completely destroyed the kingdom. And that's the end of the kingdom of Israel. And the Assyrians exiled the 10 tribes. Those are the 10 lost tribes. They're gone, never to be seen again. That is the end of the kingdom of Israel in its entirety. But then, when that happens, even after the Assyrians are done, they just keep marching south. After they devour the kingdom of Israel, they're not satisfied. They keep marching south, and they actually lay siege to Yerushalayim. And so it's an insane situation where, in order to fight off one attack by this alliance of Israel and Aram that are at the gates of at the walls of Yerushalayim, King Achaz invites in the Syrian army. They destroy the kingdom of Israel, and they wind up at the walls of Yerushalayim. So now, basically, Yerushalayim is being besieged, but by an even stronger power than the one that was being sieged, that was besieging it before. Okay. So basically, the two kingdoms of Israel in that period did not get along. And the Gemara in Masechet Yoma famously tells us, it asks the question, why were the two Beit HaMikdash destroyed? Why were they destroyed? And the Gemara there says, Mikdash Rishon mipnei macharav. It asks, why was the first Beit HaMikdash destroyed? Mipnei shlosha dvarim shehayu bo. Because of three things that were going on then. Avodah zarah, v'gilui arayot, u'shvichut damim. The three cardinal sins, the worst sins you could do. Idol worship, sexual misconduct, and murder. Okay, so those are the traditional reasons given for why the first Beit HaMikdash was destroyed. Then the Gemara asks further. It says, well, if that's the case, why was the second Beit HaMikdash destroyed? And also a famous answer, the Gemara says, so it says, lelamdecha, to teach you. Or sorry, I should start a half line earlier. So it says, why was it destroyed? Mipnei shehaita bo sinat chinam. Okay, that we all know. Why was the second Beit HaMikdash destroyed? Because of wanton hatred, sinat chinam. And then the Gemara goes on and says, lelamdecha, to teach you, sheshkula sinat chinam keneged shlosha averot. Because sinat chinam is equal in its terribleness to those three cardinal sins: avodah zarah, gilui arayot, u'shvichut damim. Okay, so the second Beit HaMikdash was destroyed because of wanton hatred, which comes to teach you that itself is as bad as all those terrible sins that led to the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash. Okay, But bottom line, based on everything we've seen so far, it may be that the Gemara tells us that the second Beit HaMikdash was destroyed because of wanton hatred, but unfortunately, we see from all of those stories of Tanakh that in the period of Beit Rishon, of the first temple, there was plenty of infighting as well. The second temple period had no monopoly on that. So bottom line, we see Tanakh tells us that our soft spot as a people, it seems, sometimes is our tendency to tear ourselves apart and maybe even to do our enemy's job for them. Okay, so all that so far, let's take a pause. All that so far is a biblical story, right? That all comes from the books of Malachim. But it's really a background. The reason we went through that is really as background for a modern story and something we're going to learn, from a more modern teaching, let's say. So the modern story that we're going to talk about actually begins with a question that was raised in 1967 after Israel's amazing success in the Six-Day War and the liberation of the old city of Jerusalem. Okay, and this question that we're going to think about was asked by Rav Moshe Tzvi Neria. Okay, just like a very quick background on him. So he was a disciple of Rav Kook. He was born in Poland, but he moved to Eretz Yisrael in 1930. He studied at Merkaz Harav, and he would go on to a big career, let's say. He helped establish the Bnei Akiva youth movement. He was a member of Knesset. He was a Rosh Yeshiva. So, okay, Rav Neria asks, in the aftermath of the Six-Day War, here's his interesting question. He says, why did our efforts to win the Old City in 1948 fail? And why did we succeed this time? Okay, that's his question. Why did we fail to have the Old City in 1948? And why did we succeed to get the Old City in 1967? Okay, so it's an interesting question. And of course, it just as the backstory to that, because sometimes it's easy to forget these days. We're so used to having the Old City. But of course, for the first 19 years of the state, from 1948 to 1967, we did not have the Old City, right? It was controlled by the Jordanian army. No Jews were allowed there. And these days, we've gotten kind of used to walking through Mamila, it's like very high-end, ritzy area. And then we walk through Shar Yafo, and we get to walk into the, walk down to the Kotel. It all seems so easy. But of course, in the early days of the state, none of that would have been possible. We did not have access to the Old City. All of those really fancy areas just outside the walls would have been kind of no man's land. And then in 1967, all that changed. Okay, so that is the backdrop to Rav Neria's interesting question. He says, how do we make sense of all that? How do we make sense of the fact that in 1948, we were granted this great miracle of the founding of the state of Israel, and yet we did not merit to control the Old City? And then all that changed in 1967, and suddenly we did merit to control the Old City. So if not then why now? And that's the question. Okay. So here's Rav Neria's answer. This is where he's headed. He says, for starters, to be pointed out, that was true in the story of Tanakh as well. So when Bnei Israel, we're told that when Bnei Israel first entered the land, back in the days of Yehoshua, we lived for hundreds of years as separate tribes, and we had no central capital. For hundreds of years, we didn't have Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim, we were told, remained in the hands of the Yevusi, the Jebusites. In the early days of living in our land, in the whole of the book of Yoshua, and the whole of the book of Shoftim, and through much of, at least the early part of Shmuel, Aleph, we're just divided up, and we have no capital, and we have a roving Mishkan with no permanent home. We did not have Yerushalayim for hundreds of years. And then that changed. And that changes under David HaMelech, right? King David shows up, and he conquers Yerushalayim, and he makes it his capital. And of course, that's where his son Shlomo will build the Beit HaMikdash. So Rav Neria says, it seems that while we're living in the land for a long time, we actually don't get Yerushalayim from the beginning. We only get Yerushalayim once we have a united monarchy. There's something about that, and are having a united monarchy that allows us, you might say, to merit Yerushalayim, to have this one permanent place, to be our capital, to be the place of the Beit HaMikdash, instead of kind of this roving Mishkan. One kingdom instead of 12 tribes that themselves kind of went to war against each other. And the Gemara, also in Yoma, tells us that the city of Yerushalayim had a special status, that it belonged to all of Bnei Israel, not any one tribe. It says Yerushalayim lo nitchalka lishvatim. Yerushalayim was not allocated. It was not allocated into the tribal area of any one tribe. So you could think of that almost like the District of Columbia in the U.S., right? That we make a big deal here that this DC does not belong to any one state because it's all of ours. And so too, Yerushalayim did not belong to any one tribe. It's all of our shared inheritance, but we didn't inherit it from the beginning. So the most holy place of all belongs to all of us. It's a beautiful thought. So Rav Neria, getting back to his explanation, he starts out with that biblical background. We started out without Yerushalayim. Later, once we had a united monarchy, we merited Yerushalayim. And then Rav Neria zooms into his time. And here's how he tells the story. He says that in 1948, during the War of Independence, he says, we were not united enough. And we were not united specifically in our fight for Jerusalem. So let's explain that. Recall that prior to the founding of the state, during the British Mandate period, there were different armed Jewish militias, you could say, different groups of Jews who were fighting for what would ultimately be Hakamat HaMedina. Okay, and of course you had the Haganah, you had the Irgun. We look back now, and sometimes looking back, we see that they all played their roles and they all played their part in what wound up being the creation of the State of Israel. But at the time, these groups were not buddy-buddy. They were in competition with each other for hearts and minds, right? Because each of them wanted people to think and act more like them. And sometimes they were literally in conflict with each other. Sometimes they were literally fighting with each other. And of course, not to go through all that kind of sadder side of that history, but there were these events that are worth mentioning. So, you had the whole kind of hunting season of 1944, 1945. That's prior to the founding of the state, of course, but that's the period where the Haganah helped the British hunt down members of the Irgun and the Lehi. So that was a time when the Haganah was helping the British to capture other Jews that they considered to be too extreme. Okay, and then of course, not to mention the Altalena affair, this kind of very painful, scarring affair right at the time, just after the founding of the state, where it's IDF troops that are firing on other Jews on an Irgun-controlled ship. And that ship, of course, was carrying arms that the IDF, I guess that the state considered to be that should have gone to the IDF. The Irgun said no. Some of these should stay in Irgun hands. Okay, all that today, again, maybe I'm maybe young enough for that to feel like ancient history. These days, I think we look back and we see the bigger picture that all those groups were ultimately fighting for the same cause, to found the new Jewish state. But at the time, these factions were very deep and they were real divides. Okay, so that is what Rav Neria is recalling when he says that at that time in 1948, we were not sufficiently united to merit Jerusalem. And in particular, here's how he explains it. He says that that this division actually played out in the battle for Jerusalem itself in 1948. When the state was declared in the War of Independence, the IDF, right, Sahal, absorbed all of the pre-state militias into one united fighting force. That's true. In general, that's true. The Haganah and the Irgun came together and they agreed that there would be one army, right, the IDF. They would fight against a common enemy of the invading Arab states. But in Yerushalayim specifically, that was not true. In Yerushalayim specifically, things were different. The Irgun's Jerusalem brigade was not disbanded, and it was not absorbed into the IDF. In fact, the Irgun's Jerusalem brigade remained independent, which actually is this little detail which stands behind the Altalena affair, because Begin's argument of why he needed arms to be specifically for the Irgun was because there still was an Irgun in one place, and that was in Yerushalayim. That was the one place where the Irgun remained a separate fighting force apart from the IDF, and that's why he needed those weapons. Okay, so the bigger picture, at just a time when we should have been coming together, even then we were literally firing upon ourselves and still had separation between us. So Rav Neria looks at that, looks back on that, and he says that that lack of unity in the way that we fought for Yerushalayim in the 1948 War of Independence was symptomatic. He says that the Palmach forces of the IDF came in, they breached the Shar Tzion, the Zion Gate, and the Irgun forces were at the brink of coming in through the Damascus Gate. But in the end, fighting separately, as separate forces, they were not successful, and ultimately the Jordanians, at the end of the war, are in control. And so I think what he's trying to say is that in theory they were all fighting the same fight, but in practice we were divided, disunited, and so we failed. In 1948 War of Independence, the war ends with the old city under Jordanian control, and that's how Rav Neria lays out the story of 1948 before, and of course that's the foil for when he says, what happened in 1967? What was different? Okay, so let's remind ourselves a little bit about what was happening in 1967. So at that time, as the Six-Day War, was approaching, there was this great anxiety that gripped Israel. Because Nasser in Egypt he moved his forces to the border. He kicked out the UN peacekeepers that were stationed there. He closed the Straits of Tiran. All of this was just the kind of the noose tightening, so to speak, and war was in the air. And when that happened, the prime minister at the time, Levi Eshkol, was from a Mapai party. That's, of course, the party, Ben Gurion's party, which had controlled every government that Israel had ever had. Because in Israel's early days, the same party always won. First under Ben Gurion, Sharet, Ben Gurion again, now Eshkol. Anyways, single party rule. The opposition, Cheirut Party, led by Menachem Begin, had never seriously competed for power, and Mapai had never been willing to sit in a government that included Cheirut. Right? Cheirut basically is like the Irgunniks, and Mapai, let's say, are the Haganahniks, and the Mapai never was going to sit in the government with Cheirut. And Ben Gurion, will recall, did not like Begin one bit, and he really treated him with disdain. Apparently, Ben Gurion referred to Begin as that man, Ha'ish Hahu, rather than even using his name. And he treated Cheirut like a bunch of extremists beyond the pale. He would not sit with them in government. Okay, but despite all of that kind of infighting that dated all the way back to 48 and before, now there was an existential war on the horizon. Something changed. And in June of 1967, June 1st of 1967, Eshkol agreed to form a unity government with Begin's Cheirut party. Cheirut was on the inside for the first time. Whatever their peacetime differences, at that crucial moment, it seems that people realized that Israelis had to be united. And that's what happened. They got on board with that, which was a big lift, right? Not to be taken for granted. So anyways, what Rav Neria is kind of pointing out is think about how much had changed. In 1948, the division between, he doesn't put it in this detail, but again, this is background, right? The division between, let's just say, Ben Gurion's men and Begin's men was so great that they literally could fire one on the other. Now, the leader of the party of Ben Gurion was inviting Begin into the government so that the country could face a bigger existential threat, a bigger enemy together, united. And the results were incredibly successful, as we know. Okay, and that's the bit of history that Rav Neria is pointing at. I have to say, and I don't want to get too into politics. It's not my favorite topic, but it's hard for me as I hear this story of the unity that emerged in 1967 in the face of that upcoming war. It's hard for me not to think a little bit about our own times. I will say for myself that at the beginning of the most recent war, we saw how compromised Israel can be when it's internally divided. October 6th, let's say, was a kind of an awful period of infighting in Israeli society. that felt so terribly divided at that time. And then when the war started, we saw that amazing power of Israelis to find unity when they need it. And that was when everybody used the tagline, "B'yachad nenatzeach," that we'll win together. It was really a time where it really felt like people were coming together. Um, and I personally hoped at that time, obviously too optimistically or maybe too naively at the time, that the politicians would take a page from the playbook of 1967 and form a unity government. That in a moment of big national challenge, that just people would find a way to come together, not just on the streets, but also politically. Anyways, for whatever set of reasons, that's not how things played out. Um, and anyway, so from the way I see it, while amazing achievements have been made in this latest war, I do think that we've paid and continue to pay a price for the disunity that we've also had to live with in that same time period. So anyways, thank God we seem to be emerging from the war, but it seems more important than ever for us to find a way to find that unity that maybe we had at the beginning of the war, maybe we lost, that the politics have never figured out how to come together in the way that, maybe in 1967, a different generation of leaders figured out how to do. And it was easy for me to say. I recognize it's hard to find common ground when there's deep disagreement, and everyone loves unity if unity means that the other side bends. But sometimes we just have to figure out how to remember that we're on the same side even when we disagree. Um, anyways, the political classes today couldn't figure that out quite. But anyways, that's a little aside. Um, Bringing it back to Rav Neria in his time. So this is really how he ends off. This is the way he ends the story. He says that considering the events of the Six-Day War, he argues that it's no coincidence that in 1967, a united IDF, now really fighting as one, not the way it had been in 48, but a united IDF fighting as one on behalf of a national unity government of Israel. Again, kind of the political classes finding unity in 67 that they had not had in 48. Reb Neria says that unity allowed them to enter the old city through the Lion's Gate as one and reunite Yerushalayim. And he basically is saying, when we're united, we merit Yerushalayim. In 48, we did not have that unity. We did not merit Yerushalayim. In 67, we had that unity, and so we merited it. In short, Reb Neria makes the case that in biblical times and in modern times, if we are united, then we will merit Yerushalayim. So anyways, I think we have to decide which model will we go forward with today. I hope we'll take this message to heart. I think we need it now more than ever, that we need to expect unity and demand unity, because only when we are unified will we merit and achieve having Yerushalayim. Okay, so I'll leave with that message for us to think of in this month of Cheshvan. Thank you.